Blood. It's liquid life. Now, I know that sounds strange, but have you ever thought about everything that our blood does for our body? Transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide, carrying hormones, proteins, sugars, and more. That red sticky liquid pumping around our body about once every second is absolutely crucial for every living system. Blood is a type of connective tissue. If you forgot from our tissues unit, all tissues have two components, the living cells and the non-living matrix. The living blood cells are what we call the formed elements. This consists of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The non-living matrix is called plasma. As for the characteristics of blood, blood is a sticky, opaque fluid with a somewhat metallic taste. It is the only fluid tissue in the human body. Its metallic taste is due to iron content in the blood. Iron, as we will talk about later, is essential for oxygen transport. Blood can vary in color depending on how much oxygen is in your body. If it's dark red, it is low in oxygen. This is usually found in venous blood. If it's a bright red, it's very high in oxygen. We usually found this a lot in our arteries, but also can be found in capillaries during the exchange as well. That's why sometimes if you get a paper cut, the blood is super bright red. And if you go get your blood drawn, which is usually from venous blood, it's usually a darker red. Let's not forget that blood is never blue. It's just different hues of red. Blood is slightly basic, with a pH of about 7.35. We call things that are basic alkaline. The temperature of our blood is around 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Finally, blood makes up about 8% of our total body weight. So what's the specifics of what makes up our blood? First, let's talk about the cells, otherwise known as the formed elements. You may want to put a star by this because a lot of people tend to forget what makes up the formed elements. The formed elements are only the three types of cells. First, we have erythrocytes, or red blood cells. This is mostly what makes up our formed elements. Red blood cells are biconcave discs with large surface areas to transport oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide. About 1% of our formed elements is otherwise known as the buffy coat. When blood is centrifuged or sped up really fast, the blood separates into its separate components based off of weight. The buffy coat sits in between the weights of plasma and red blood cells. The buffy coat is platelets or thrombocytes, which are used for blood clotting, and leukocytes or white blood cells, which help with our immune system. Here's a picture of our blood under a microscope. You may remember this picture from our tissues unit. You can see here that most of what makes up the cells is red blood cells. There are a few platelets and a few white blood cells. "55% of our total blood content is plasma. Plasma is the non-living component of blood. The liver is responsible for making plasma. Yet another function that the liver does in our body, and we'll talk more about the liver next unit. 90% of plasma is water. Water is important for heat absorption and dissolving other substances. 10% of the volume of plasma goes to things like salt, plasma proteins, nutrients, wastes, gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen, and hormones. So now that we know the components of blood, let's talk about the functions. First, our blood helps with distribution. Whether it's getting things to our cells, carrying things away from our cells, The blood is what's going to do that. We have gases, nutrients, wastes, and hormones, just to name a few things it distributes. Second, the blood helps with balancing homeostasis. The blood helps regulate temperature with vasodilation and constriction. The blood also helps regulate pH levels, electrolyte balance, and water balance. Finally, the blood helps protect us against foreign pathogens and helps with blood clotting. Remember that white blood cells help with immunity and platelets help with blood clotting. Let's take a closer look at the two major types of cells in our bodies. First, we have erythrocytes, or red blood cells. As mentioned before, they have a large surface area to carry oxygen. They do not have a nucleus, and that's because they're trying to conserve the oxygen by not using any of it. Hemoglobin is found on these cells, and that's what combines with oxygen. Iron is needed for hemoglobin to function properly, hence why we have an irony taste to our blood. There are way more red blood cells than white blood cells, as we talked about before. The spleen and liver have to help destroy red blood cells since they don't have a nucleus and die rather quickly. And red blood cells also never divide, so our body has to constantly make new ones and get rid of old ones. Leukocytes are another word for white blood cells. As mentioned before, leukocytes function in immunity. White blood cells are generally much larger in size, but smaller in numbers. White blood cells can actually slip in and out of our blood vessels to help with immunity. White blood cells have a distinct and differentiated organelles, unlike red blood cells, and they can divide and reproduce. The only real big similarity between red blood cells and white blood cells is that they're both made in the bone marrow. Platelets are sometimes not even considered a cell. Platelets or thrombocytes are fragments of cells and are important in blood clotting. We will talk more about this later. Now, let's talk about some physiological aspects of the blood. First, we'll talk about how blood cells are made, or hematopoiesis. I know that sounds like a crazy word, but we'll try to break it apart. Hema means blood, topoi means cells, and esis means formation. Don't confuse this word with homeostasis, because I know they kind of have similar roots and endings. All blood cells come from a stem cell called a hemocytoblast. This is a stem cell found in the bone marrow. A hemocytoblast will differentiate into either a lymphoid cell or a myeloid cell. Lymphoid cells will only become lymphocytes. Myeloid cells become everything else in the blood. Remember that lymphocytes are the highly specialized T and B cells, hence why they have their own stem cell. One unique thing about red blood cells is their total lack of organelles and nucleus. Therefore, red blood cells never divide. They just live, carry oxygen, and die. That means our body has to pump out red blood cells from one single location, and they have to be processed to be excreted out of the body when they die. The spleen and liver both work to break down our red blood cells. Hemoglobin turns into bilirubin by the liver, and excess amounts are excreted in our urine. Next unit, we'll talk more about bilirubin, but this is what contributes to bile in our urine's yellow color. When our body needs more red blood cells, they can't just divide, so our body has to secrete erythropoietin from our kidneys for our red bone marrow to create more cells. We mentioned this hormone when we talked about the endocrine system. The reason why this hormone comes from the kidneys is because kidneys help filter all of our blood, so they can monitor the amount of the red blood cells that we need. We'll talk more about kidneys and their function next unit. White blood cells can divide, so they have different signals called colony-stimulating factors and interleukins to help them divide. Next, let's talk about a process called hemostasis, or blood clotting. No, I didn't say homeostasis, although they do sound similar. Hemo means blood, and stasis means staying the same. So it's basically a word that says our blood stops moving out of our busted vessels. Hemostasis will only happen if a blood vessel breaks. This can either be external, like a cut, or internal, which eventually causes a hematoma or bruising. The steps of hemostasis can get really complex, but we'll only talk about the basics. First, a vascular spasm occurs, meaning that the smooth muscles will constrict to try to stop blood flow. Then, a platelet plug will form. Platelets adhere to exposed collagen fibers, and they actually don't stick to each other, which is pretty interesting. Then, something called a coagulation cascade occurs. Prothrombin turns into thrombin, and thrombin allows for meshing to occur of the fibers. Clotting usually takes about 3 to 6 minutes to occur. Fun fact, that's why they say to put pressure on an area that's bleeding and to not wipe away the blood, as wiping away the blood prohibits the clot to form. Let's talk about some diseases associated with our blood. The first one is sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is when an amino acid has been switched in the coding of our red blood cells. This switch causes the cells to form a sickle shape. It impairs oxygen transport and causes issues with them damming up in our blood vessels. This is a genetically recessive trait. Fun fact, people who are heterozygous for this trait, or meaning they carry the sickle cell trait, are actually resistant to malaria because this trait causes potassium transport problems for the virus. The next disease is called polycythemia. This is another word for excessive red blood cells. This can be a sign of bone marrow cancer or happens when you're in really high altitudes where there's less oxygen. Anemia is when your body doesn't have enough red blood cells. This can be caused from a number of ways, such as hemorrhagic anemia, meaning you've lost a lot of blood by bleeding, hemolytic, meaning your cells are being destroyed prematurely, usually from a mismatched blood transfusion or some sort of blood infection. Anemia can also be aplastic, meaning that your body is destroying your bone marrow. The cause of this is usually unknown. The most common type of anemia is from low hemoglobin due to low iron. Remember that we talked about how iron is necessary for hemoglobin to function. Low iron can be due to a diet problem or it can be genetic. Pernicious anemia is another type of anemia that's caused by a deficiency in B12. B12 is absolutely essential for hemoglobin use, and for some reason your body starts attacking B12. Leukemia is when the bone marrow becomes cancerous. A huge number of immature white blood cells become in the blood, but these blood cells aren't able to do their jobs properly, impairing immune function. Lymphoma is when you have cancer of the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system is tied really closely to white blood cells, as we talked about last unit. There are several diseases associated with hemostasis or blood clotting. A thrombus is a clot that's in a blood vessel, but it hasn't quite come detached. Obviously, this can cause blood circulation problems and blockages. An embolus is a blood clot that is free floating in the bloodstream. It only becomes a problem when it causes a block in places like the heart, lungs, or another organ. Thrombocytopenia is another word for a platelet deficiency. This can happen due to drugs, radiation, or cancer. Finally, hemophilia is a hereditary bleeding disorder where platelets aren't made properly. There are several types of hemophilias, which are all different genetic mutations. Finally, a cardiac infarction is another word for a heart attack. A heart attack is caused by one of the coronary arteries being blocked in flow, causing the heart to not get oxygen. This causes the cells to start to misfire and rapidly die from the lack of oxygen. Cardiac infarctions can happen due to buildup of cholesterol in the artery walls. This can happen due to a diet high in cholesterol, or it can be somewhat genetic. Sometimes, high stress on the heart can cause the arteries to pump harder. This can also lead to blockages in the coronary arteries, which can also lead to a heart attack. It's important to know the signs of a heart attack, as rapid intervention is needed to thin the blood and sometimes go into surgery to remove the blockage. Symptoms of a cardiac infarction include chest pain, weakness, pain in jaw or neck, pain in shoulders, and shortness of breath. In your notes, you have a picture on the right which shows the results of a blood test. We will actually be doing a blood test in class, which I think will be really fun. Essentially, if you see clotting or little dots appear, That means that this type of blood is positive for the presence of that antigen, as the antibody is put on the sample to see if it clots. The antibody causes clotting to occur rapidly if the antigen is present. You may have heard that there are a few different types of blood: A, B, AB, or O. This has to do with you either having one, two, or no antigens. Blood typing can also be positive or negative. This is another type of antigen that can be present in blood, and there's actually more than one. We call this the Rh factor. It's much more rare for people to be negative than positive because there's several genes that contribute to the positive and negative aspects of blood. When we're looking at blood typing, a genotype is what genetically you have in your DNA. A phenotype is what shows. Sometimes you can carry genes without showing it. If you remember anything from Bio 1, we would call this person a heterozygote, meaning they carry one big letter and one little letter. We usually represent blood types with the letter I. Big I means dominant, and little I means recessive. We also superscript the I to either be A or B. A and B are co-dominant, meaning that they equally show up if you carry two of these traits. O, on the other hand, is totally recessive, meaning that we represent that with the little I. So, someone who is type A could actually be IA or IA little I. The same thing is for type B. A person who is type B can be IB or IB little I. Someone AB can only have one type, IA, IB, and someone who's type O can only be little I. Again, positive and negative have to do with an Rh factor. Positive means you have one other type of antigen present. Negative means that you have no Rh factor antigen present. I want to make it clear that blood typing, although sometimes following traditional genetic principles, can sometimes have strange occurrences in the blood. For example, even if your mom and dad were both AB, there have been instances of children not uptaking one or both of these antigens. So, it's not always true that you can determine your blood type, even though you know your parents. We'll talk more about this in class.